he, Von Borka, and Mosby met at a home in Bergersville. Fitz Lee's command wasn't up yet, so Stuart tied his horse to a picket fence, spread his cloak on the front porch of a home, took off his sash, hat, and gloves, and lay down to get some sleep. The two men who were supposed to keep watch fell asleep. They awoke to the hoofbeats of Federal horsemen. Mosby was the first to hear the hoofbeats and woke Stuart up. Mosby rode off to find Fitz Lee and ran into the Union troopers who fired their pistols. Mosby quickly turned around and rode back toward Stuart. Stuart and Von Borka scrambled for their horses with Stuart jumping the fence on his horse Skylark. After a mile of pursuit, the Indian horsemen gave up. Stuart, in his haste, left his hat, sash, haversack, and gloves, but he lost something more valuable. One of the watchmen who fell asleep was captured, and he held instructions from Lee about Stuart's ride to the Union rear. This resulted in the Union Army withdrawing. The Federal horsemen were able to get so close to capturing Stuart because they crossed the Rapidan River at a location that was to be guarded by soldiers under Robert Toombs. Toombs had pulled his troops away to cook breakfast, and the way across the Rapidan River was open for the troopers. On August 20th, Stuart and two of his brigades, those under Fitz Lee and Robertson, moved across the Rapidan River. As Jeb rode by his troops, every now and then a soldier would yell out, "Where's your hat?" Stuart would just laugh and continue on. He quickly found replacements for his lost accoutrements. On June 21st, Stuart planned to get into the Union rear and destroy the railroad bridge over Cedar Run, where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad ran. On the 22nd, he agreed to the plan. In a driving rain and thunderstorm, Stuart's horsemen pushed on toward Catlett Station, first stopping at Warrenton. There, he and his staff met a young lady, who, when she found out they were going to Catlett Station, asked Stuart to help her lose a bet. Jeb was perplexed why she would want to lose a bet. She explained that a Union quartermaster named Charles Goulding boarded at her house while the Union Army was in the area, and he bet her a bottle of wine that he would be in Richmond in 30 days. She wanted Jeb to capture Goulding and take him to Richmond as a prisoner, thereby losing her bet, but bringing him to Richmond in a way he didn't plan. As Stuart's men rode on, in the darkness, they discovered they were in the middle of the Union camp, very near Polk's headquarters. Down the road came a man singing, "Carry me back to old Virginia," using a tin bucket to keep time. He was surprised when he ran into Stuart and his staff. The black man beating on the bucket knew Stuart from a pre-war connection and told them he had been pressed into serving a Union officer. He told Jeb where Polk's headquarters were and the location of the infantry camps. With that information, Jeb got close to Polk's headquarters.
Oh, because the light. Yeah, okay. Kind of necessary. That's right. Okay, where's our man? Is he here? He's coming. Okay, I'll wait till he's here. Should I go usher? Yeah, why not go out and make sure he's in? We could bring him up here. I'll move over. Thank you. Okay, let's do it. Hope I can see. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 34th season of the Scottsdale Civil War Roundtable. With that number, we are now one of the oldest surviving roundtables in the country, as well as one of the largest. And we thank both of those numbers to you, our members. Thank you very much. I'm Dick Cox. I am Vice President of the Roundtable. Mark Stoller couldn't be here today. He is doing battlefield tours, but not our battlefield tours. He's in France and Belgium doing World War I battlefield tours. Go figure. He'll be here next month. We are meeting, of course, on September 17th. September 17th is a fairly famous day in history. Today is Constitution Day. It is the 237th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. Both sides, North and South, had varying interpretations of the Constitution. And it's one of the things that we study when we get held into Civil War history. But it's also, on a more sad note, it's 162nd anniversary of the Battle of Antietam today, the bloodiest day in U.S. history. And on a personal note, my only Civil War ancestor was killed at the Battle of Antietam. We have an exciting schedule this year. I'm going to go through it briefly so you can get a preview of where we're going to be spending our time with our speakers. In October, we have Thomas Cutler talking about the Sink of Shame, the Red River campaign. In November, we have Kristen Pavlock Trout speaking about Mississippi, Missouri's Civil War. George Rabel comes in December to tell us about the conflict of command, George McClellan, Abraham Lincoln, and the politics of war. In January, Gary Gallagher, I'm sure that's a name known to most of you, is coming to do the Ed Barrs Memorial Lecture, talking about celebrating Union victory, the grand review in history and memory. February brings us Alice Rosino, the calamity at Frederick, Robert E. Lee, Special Orders number 191, and Confederate misfortune on the road to Antietam. March 18, Chris Makowski, another famous historian, is talking about something very current, the Civil War monuments controversy and memory. In April, another famous historian, this time probably a principal historian of Abraham Lincoln, is Harold Holzer, coming to speak about Abraham Lincoln and American immigration. He'll be here on April 15th, which is the 159th anniversary of Lincoln's death. And concluding our season is Terry Pierce, coming in May, talking about thundering courage, Union boy generals in the Gettysburg campaign. Got just a couple of announcements. We have partnered with the Arizona Historical Society this year. The National History Day is an annual event designed to encourage and provide recognition to middle and high school students interested in history. Separate competitions are held for 6 to 8 and 9 through 12 grades. Projects include papers, presentations, and social media projects. Winners in each state category participate in the national finals. The Arizona Historical Society runs the event in our state, and we have the opportunity to provide judges for the 2025 competition. If you are interested in volunteering, please contact Sherry Stiegel, one of our board members, who will explain to you the process. There is a brief training period involved to become a judge. Many of us think it's going to be a very interesting partnership and something we look forward to working with the State Historical Society. We've also going to be reinvigorating the history discussion group meetings that are done a week after this presentation and the week after the coming presentations. We've had to change our location again, unfortunately. We were meeting at the Panera Bread, and the room we were in is now used a storeroom. So we have now moved to another location. We are at the Panera Bread, which is in the Cassville Shopping Center area, right on the corner of Indian Bend Road and Scottsdale Road. We have a special room all to ourselves. We've got it reserved. We think it's going to be very quiet and very nice. We've had to move back the time for start. It's no longer going to be 6:30. It's going to be 5:30 because the restaurant closes at 8 o'clock. So we'll have an earlier start time, and then we'll be closing earlier. That's all the, yes, sir.
Did you need Wildflower or Panera?
No, did I say Panera? No, we're going to be at the Wildflower. Yes. We were at the Panera. Panera's off. So now we're at the Wildflower. Okay, that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over now to John Taylor, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good evening, everybody. I'm John Taylor and am the new program coordinator in taking over for David Ward, who has abandoned us to the coast of North Carolina. So anyway, tonight we're very excited to have Robert Jenkins speaking to us about the Atlanta campaign. Robert is a practicing attorney in Dalton, Georgia, and has been practicing there for a few years. It sounds like we don't want to give away his age by saying how long he's been practicing law in Georgia. But he's authored a new book, The Cassville Affairs, which is the subject of tonight's lecture. Everybody, give a hand for Robert.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate that very much. We'll see if we can find our way through this little pleasure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your hospitality. My wife Sherry and I arrived Saturday and flew in Saturday and spent a couple of nights down in Tucson, and we've enjoyed the Sonoran Desert Museum. And I'm going to mess up the pronunciation. I love to butcher things, sometimes intentional and sometimes not. But the saguaro cactus and east and west. We managed to catch those at the Pima Air Space Museum and Mission and several other things. So it was a great time, and we've enjoyed Scottsdale, and we appreciate very much your hospitality. I've known David Ward. Had the privilege of doing a tour for Dave when he had his bus tours, and helped with part of his Atlanta campaign tour, along with friends of mine, Richard McMurray and Steve Davis. And then my friend John Fritz, who was dressed up as a Union soldier in the lobby. If you saw, I'm sure you all know John, and he frequents the Atlanta area and Dalton and Kennesaw and Resaca oftentimes, and wears in memory and in honor of his ancestor from the 105th Illinois. But thank you all very much. And John gave me this hat a couple of years back, so I'll go Diamondbacks and maybe go a little Atlanta Braves. So hopefully you won't have too many hisses from the Snakes over the Braves. But let's get started with a little fun here. Let's talk about the Atlanta campaign and see what we know about it. Before we get into too deep into it, how many of you have VD? It's okay. It's okay. You can. This is sort of like an AA meeting. Okay, we can just be on a first name basis. Hi, I'm Bob, and I no longer have VD. Virginia disease. Y'all were thinking I was talking about something else, right? Okay. Well, you realize that the war was won in the West. Okay, now all the excitement, all the newspapers, all the sexy stuff happened in Virginia and Gettysburg and Fredericksburg and other burgs, but the war was really won or lost, depending on your perspective, in the Western theater. Now, you all being, how many are native Arizonans here? 3, 4 people, maybe 5, 4.5. I saw 4.5. Okay, how many are from the Midwest originally? Most of you. How many are from the South? Couple, 3. All right, 4. It's okay. We're in the minority. We're in the. So this is obviously a melting pot. And I grew up in Atlanta, in Metro Atlanta, which is also a melting pot of people from all over the world, really. And what a beautiful place to live in Phoenix and Scottsdale here. But the war was won in the Western theater, and I don't mean Pikachu Pass, although I had the privilege, Sherry and I hiked that yesterday, and thank the Lord that we had some cover with a little bit of rain and a little bit of cloud cover, which made it not as unbearably hot. It's a dry heat, they tell us. But But the Western Theater, of course, is the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. Anything west of the Mississippi River was called the Trans-Mississippi. And so now we are thinking of, in terms of the Western Theater, being the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. And that's where Grant and Sherman did their thing, of course, and brought the South to its knees. By the way, how much time do y'all give a person up here? Because I'm going to go ahead and put a timer on here so that I don't
50 minutes.
wear out my welcome. Okay, I'm going to put that timer right here for 50 minutes. Okay, so let's talk about Cassville. How do we get to Cassville? Well, the Atlanta campaign, many historians believe the Atlanta campaign was the pivotal sort of turning point of the war. Some people think it was Vicksburg or Gettysburg or the failure of I'll tell you what the Confederate leaders thought. The Lees and Longstreets and President Davis and Bragg, what they thought at the time was that, or just after the war, was their failure to follow up the victory at Chickamauga, which it turned out to be an empty or a Pyrrhic victory because of what happened 2 months later at Chattanooga and Lookout Mountain. And on Wisconsin for Arthur MacArthur and the 24th Wisconsin Badgers. Any Badgers in the bunch here? I thought I heard one earlier. At Missionary Ridge. So that's where a lot of the Confederate leadership believed, when they looked in retrospect, where did they miss the mark? They could lose on the corners, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, but they couldn't lose the heart, the middle. And so that became the entire strategy, right or wrong, the entire strategy for President Davis and Lee and Longstreet and Bragg and Hood, John Bell Hood, who we'll talk about tonight. The entire strategy was to try to take back the heart, take back Tennessee, all the way to the Kentucky, Ohio River if possible, but certainly Tennessee, take back the middle of the country. So that was their strategy, and that's what was driving their motivations. And that's why Hood winds up with that failed Tennessee campaign that led to Franklin and Nashville, the double disasters. That's what President Davis wanted Joseph E. Johnston to do a year earlier. So that sets the table for you from the Confederate perspective. Now, on the federal perspective, Grant, who's been promoted after the victory at Chattanooga, to go to the east to take command of the entire thing. Of course, he's going to piggyback with General Meade and the Army of the Potomac, and he's going to promote his junior and trusted officer, General William Tecumseh Sherman, to take over the thing in the west. And Grant and Sherman meet at the Burnett or the Bennett House hotel, the largest hotel at the time in the country, at Cincinnati, a month before the campaign was to start. And the plan was Grant was to go after Lee and Sherman was to go after Johnston. That's a pivotal difference. Before then, the Federals had always been trying to figure out how to go on to Richmond, how to take the enemy's capital. That'll end the war if we just take that city. That was the thought of a McDowell and a McClellan and a Burnside and a this and a Pope and a that one, right? And a Hooker. But finally, by this point in the war, the federal high command, the federal leadership figured out as long as the South had an army or armies in the field, she lived. The Confederacy lived. Think about the American Revolution. You could lose Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. General Washington did. But as long as he had an army in the field at Valley Forge, or in Valley Forge, even if it was a shell of an army, the dream of the revolution of the colonists lived. So that pivotal moment, that aha moment, began in the fall of 1863, and it actually started, the earliest I found in the official records was from Henry Halleck, Old Brains. He wrote an email. You know, they had emails back then, right? Okay, an email, electronic telegraph. They had telegraph. So there was a telegraph that Henry Halleck sends in, I think, November or October. I think it was in November, to Grant down at, still in Chattanooga at the time. And it says that I believe that the way the war can be won is if we destroy the rebel armies in the field rather than the cities. You know, they've captured Nashville early. They captured Memphis, New Orleans, you know. Okay, big deal. The South was still breathing because she still had the capacity to make war by having military operations, armies in the field. So Grant's to go after Lee, Sherman's to go after Johnston. So let's talk about Sherman and how he goes after Johnston. Sherman is trying to maintain the momentum. Sherman's military genius was in two things. One was that he had logistics, he understood logistics, and he understood momentum. Keep the pressure, keep the pressure. His army was larger. He had three armies, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Ohio, and the Army of the Tennessee, all totaled about 100,000 federal troops in and around Chattanooga to come into Georgia the 1st of May. D-Day was supposed to be May 1st. You know, D-Day, June 5th. It was actually June 6th because of bad weather in the English Channel in World War II. Well, D-Day was supposed to be May 1st, but Grant had emailed Sherman and said, I can't get the cavalry up and it's raining and we can't get all the supplies up. We're going to not be ready to go much before the 4th of May. And so they start, and Lee hits him at the Wilderness in 4th, 5th May, of course. But in the West, Sherman is trying to get his army moving by May 1st. He's not really able to get moving until May 5th, 6th, 7th. And so we have the battles at Tunnel Hill, May 7, Dug Gap, May 8, and the events around Dalton in the first and second week of May. Then we get into Resaca. And but Sherman is trying to apply pressure. And his mission by General Grant is that you are directed to go after Johnston's army, break it up if you can, and drive deep into the interior of Georgia, doing all the damage that you can. So the Atlanta campaign was really, Atlanta became the magnet. Okay, Atlanta became the magnet by which the armies were drawn because of the railroad, because the interstate, the railroad was the path by which these armies had to travel to feed them, the Western Atlantic Railroad. So as Johnston would fall back, he was tethered to that railroad and didn't draw very far away from it. And Sherman drew further down toward it. And so as this cat and mouse game occurs, Johnston starts with about 40,000 men with guns in uniforms in the trenches around Dalton. However, he had about 63,000 men of all kinds between Dalton and Resaca, including cavalry and artillery and men that were riding horses and taking paper and lunch and whatever they did to the generals and the different officers. So there were not just 40,000 Confederates defending Northwest Georgia, there were more like 60. By the time they get to Resaca, Johnston is getting reinforcements from the coast, from Savannah, from Charleston, from Mobile, from Pensacola, and from the Army of Mississippi, west of Demopolis, Alabama, Meridian, Mississippi, those areas, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, T-Town, they call it over there, Roll Tide. But they're all coming over to Georgia. So by the time they fall back to a place called Cassville, which is about halfway between Dalton and Atlanta, Dalton and Atlanta are separated in the Western Atlantic Railroad about 88 miles. And right there in the middle, below Calhoun, below Adairsville, a little town called Cassville. And Cassville was where Johnston was going to plan a surprise, plan a counterattack on Sherman as he's chasing him, and he's divided his force. And Johnston figures, well, maybe Sherman has been stupid enough to divide his forces under in several wings, several groups on different roads, and that he can counterattack on one of those wings. So let's look into that a little bit. There are 5 things that I want you to learn about Cassville tonight, if we can learn 5 things, okay, for our teachers in the group here. And by the way, as a trial lawyer, I was ruined, I guess, in law school, but I was taught that you are to tell things 3 times. You tell them in the opening statement to the jury. You tell folks during the trial, repeat it and reinforce it, and then you drive it home, of course, with once more with feeling, that third verse in the closing argument, and so that's to reinforce the idea. And the one thing that I've always learned after the end of a jury trial is when we talk to the jurors and we ask, well, what did you think about? And they usually tell us, well, we wish we'd heard a little more of this, a little less of that. But you don't have to tell. We got it the first time. You didn't have to tell us 3 times. And I'm thinking, okay, there's that law school training. But the truth at Cassville, there are TRUTH. Number one, there were actually 2 affairs, not 1. So who's familiar with the Cassville affair? Anybody in particular? Okay, so the Atlanta campaign, Sherman, Johnston, anything? Okay, what about 20th Maine, Little Round Top, Gettysburg? Okay, so we are not going to be talking about Gettysburg tonight. You've got 2 or 3 guys and folks that are going to come talk to you about some of the Eastern, the VD stuff, other nights. But tonight we're going to talk about how the West was won and Cassville. So Johnston was planning this counterattack, and is what we've always thought in history. And one of the mysteries was that morning, the Confederates failed to strike their offensive. They failed to launch for some reason. That's the morning affair. The evening affair, the second event, was that night. Johnston was trying to dig in and defend, but wound up bugging out during the night and did not stay to fight Sherman the next day, Friday, the 20th of May. And so those are the 2 different decisions. The Confederates had to decide, do they want to play offense in the morning or do they want to play defense in the evening? That's the 2 affairs. Second thing is the roads were confusing. They were confusing then, they're confusing now. They've been confusing historians. They even confused Johnston and Hood back then. And the ironic thing is the Federals had better maps than the Confederates did of this particular battlefield. So we'll talk about that. Number 3, untruthful. Someone has been lying to us. I got to be careful with that word lying. I have a judge, Judge Charlie Pinnell from Eaton, Georgia. That's a little north of Chatsworth, Georgia. He says, Jenkins, you can use any word you wish, but don't use lying. I hate that word. You could say he misrepresented, he misremembered, he was forgetful, he was untruthful, but do not say lying in my courtroom. So anyway, somebody has been untruthful to us. Anybody want to take a guess if I give you a couple of choices here? Joseph E. Johnston, if you think he was the one that has been untruthful to history, raise your hand. 1. How about John Bell Hood? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. We got about 20, 15. Okay. Interesting. All right. Number 4, we're going to talk about the troopers, the cavalry. We thought that Cassville was about a surprise infantry attack. It turns out it was about the cavalry. And then number 5, you can't talk about Cassville and about the Atlanta campaign or controversy without talking about John Bell Hood. So we're going to cover that a little bit. So the 2 affairs, we'll throw them out there. The 2 affairs, one was in the morning, as I described, and the second one was the evening Confederate defense decision. All right, so if you look, let's see if this has a laser pointer, I don't think so. If you look to the top, you see a town called Adairsville, and there's actually an Adairsville affair. If any of you ever have heard from Larry Daniel, retired Methodist minister from Jackson, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, he's written a number of books, and you should get Larry out if you haven't had him come speak to you. But Larry's a great historian. He has written an article on the Adairsville affair that'll be coming out in one of Ted Savis's books, volume 3 of the Atlanta campaign, a series of essays. So be on the lookout for that. A friend of mine, Dave Powell from Chicago, has an article in that, and I have a piece in that, and a number of other historians on the Western campaign have it. But we thought that was the Cassville Triangle. Adairsville to the north, Kingston to the due south, and to the southeast, Cassville. Now, when you see that, Johnston tells us, if you go to his official report, look in the OR, let's see, Serials 38, part 3, in Johnston. It was written from Vineville, Georgia, north of Macon, on October 20, 1864. And Johnston writes his post-Atlanta remarks, post-Atlanta campaign, his report while he was in office. And he states that I planned on the evening of Tuesday, the 17th of May, to draw my army south using two roads. Hood and Polk, their two corps, would go to the southeast toward Cassville, and Hardee with the wagon train would go due south toward Kingston and then connect over to the east toward Cassville. And that I thought maybe Sherman would be stupid enough to divide his forces and I would counterstrike one of the two wings. That's what he wrote. But that's actually the real Cassville Triangle. Okay, that's what happened north of town and what didn't happen north of town, not northwest, but north and northeast of town is really the mystery of Cassville. So the Cassville affair is what I call the Cassville Triangle. Okay. Well, my clicker stopped on me. Where's the? There we go. So back up one. So when you see the right here, leading out of Adairsville, John Bell Hood's corps, actually two of his three divisions used a third road to the east, that road number 2 you see. It was called the Ironton Road by Hood. If you go to his advance and retreat, look page 99 through 102, look through there, you'll find that he talked about a road called the Ironton Road. It led from Iron Mountain. That's a confusing road that we're going to discuss tonight. But Polk's corps went down road number 1. And so there were actually 3 roads the Confederates used to get to Cassville, not 2. Roads were confusing. I'm going to throw them on the board. All right, how much liberty do I have to move around? Do I have to stay tethered to that? No. Okay, so everybody, let's move a little bit. We're getting a little sleepy-eyed. Let's move. Everybody have the left hand. If you don't have the left hand, you can use your right hand. Okay, you just have to turn it around. All right, everybody, take your left hand up. You put your left hand out. Put your left hand out. Left hand up. Okay, shake it all down. Do the Cassville shuffle, and you turn yourself. All right, this is how we're going to learn Cassville's roads. Left hand up. All right, now look at the back of your left hand. Everybody have a pinky finger? Let's imagine that Cassville is your wrist. Adairsville is up the left of your pinky finger, about 10 miles. The second finger, it has metal on it if you're married, or might have metal on it. Okay, that is the troublemaker finger. That was, Johnston calls that the Spring Place Road. He was kind of right, but mostly wrong. It was the old Spring Place Road. There was a Moravian mission 2 counties north, up in Murray County from this place. And that, in the 1820s, was a route that Native Americans, Cherokees, and Moravian missionaries and early pioneers in the 1830s and 40s would have used. However, by the Civil War, a new Spring Place Road had been created. That was road number 3. That's your big finger. Be careful with how you point your big finger. Okay, the big finger. That's the correct Spring Place Road. But everybody in history appears, but Johnston seemed to know that that is the Spring Place Road. The problem is historians have followed Johnston's story or version of history, and so everybody has misplaced the Spring Place Road to road number 2. Road number 2, it was, according to Joseph Wheeler, the Confederate cavalry commander. If you go to page 946 of the OR volume, well, 74 is a shortcut, serial 74, but 38 part 3 for the purists. Okay, so Wheeler's 946 page on the left, if you look, he says that was the Copper Mine Road. Copper Mine Road. Okay, Hood called it the Ironton Road. But Yankees actually, sorry, it's you know I learned something. You can't say Yankees and Rebels anymore. The folks with the green hats, you know, the National Park Service, they no longer say Yankees and Rebels unless they're direct, unless it's a direct quote from something. But any new historic markers are no longer using the vernacular Yankees and Rebels. Blue, gray, Union, Confederate, Federal, blue clad, all those are fine, but Yankees and Rebels is no longer apparently able to be used. So forgive me if I say Yankees or Rebels tonight.
But road number 2, the Iron Mountain Road, or Ironton Road is what Hood called it. Wheeler called it the Coppermine Road. Johnston thought it was the Spring Place Road. It used to be, but it wasn't then. Federal troops under the 23rd Corps, that Schofield's Army of the Ohio, would use that road later in this mysterious day. And they called it Marsteller's Road or Marsteller's Road. The reason they called it Marsteller's Road, M-A-R, is because when they went up to the mill, just up there to the north of it, they said, "What's the name of this place?" And some of the Southerners that lived in the area in North Georgia, in their Southern Appalachian, North Georgia speech, said Marsteller's Mill, because they talk like they ain't had any teeth since they were 9 years old, because they're from North Georgia. See, they've been carrying tobacco since they was about knee-high to a grasshopper. Okay. But in South Georgia, it's Marsteller's Mill. Okay, like Gone with the Wind. Okay, that's South Georgia. Very, very deep. That's the southern half of the state. Down there, it's so darn hot. It's like, yeah, you have to talk a little slower. Okay, my grandfather was from a little town called Boston, Georgia. And I don't mean Massachusetts. It's down near the Florida line. That's where my grandfather was from, Robert Douglas McRae. Now, but in North Georgia, they talk a little bit different. It's more like this. Okay, you see that? See, Georgia's a very diverse state. You know, we have both. All right, so, but the spelling, if you go to the diarist from the 23rd Ohio, or 23rd Army of the Ohio, 23rd Corps, you will see the M-A-R spelling, Marsteller's Mill. But the correct family name, the proper name, is M-O-S. Okay, Marsteller. Anyway, we'll move on from that little pleasure. But that road, I told you, road number 2 is the trouble. Y'all don't have your hands up. We're not going to learn this thing. Okay? Get your hands back up. Road number 1, Adairsville Road, Adairsville-Cassville Road. Road number 2, the troublemaker, all these many names that I've been saying. Road number 3, be careful, is the correct Spring Place Road. Road number 4 is the Pine Log Road. And finally, road number 5 is the road to Canton, Georgia, which is a bigger town today because Metro Atlanta is growing that way. Canton, Georgia, Cherokee County, the county seat. So there we go. Everybody lost with their roads? Okay, Johnston said there are only 2 ways to get to Cassville. The road that Hardee took down to Kingston and then over to the east, or the road that he said that Hood and Polk went down, road number 1. Well, how about that? Look at how many actual different roads across that gravelly plateau or Cassville Triangle that the federal soldiers used. How about that? A lot of different ways to get there. It looks like Gettysburg. All roads lead to Gettysburg. So how did the Confederates get it so screwed up in their maps? Blame it on Braxton Bragg. You're like, wait a minute, Braxton Bragg, he resigned back in December the year before, right? After he got defeated at Missionary Ridge, November 25th of 1863. They fall back through a series of retreats to Dalton, and that's where they stop running. So that's why Dalton features in the Atlanta campaign and in the Civil War. Well, Braxton Bragg, back in the fall of 1863, he commissioned the Confederate Engineering Department to create a series of maps. And he said, I want to have a bunch of good detailed maps all up and down the railroad, up in between the Tennessee state line and Atlanta. I want to have good roads so that I can, and for 10 miles on either side, 10 miles on either side of the Western Atlantic Railroad, so that next year, if we should have to fall back on that line and fight from there, I want to be able to know all the roads that we can use. And if you look on that map, this is the result of that. The problem is, Cassville was not on the railroad. Cassville was a school town, was a county seat, but the railroad went to Kingston to the left. Why? Because it was flat. It was down a floodplain, down a creek basin. The gravelly plateau is this high dome, hilly thing that would have been hard for engineers to run a train through, if not impossible in those days. So, when the engineers drew that, look at the space to the northeast corner. You see this? Okay, that's off the map. That's 10, 11, 12 miles from the railroad that would have been right over here. And guess where the surprise, guess where the federal troopers that are going to disrupt Johnston and Hood's planned counterattack at Cassville are going to come from? Right over there. Guess where the Spring Place Road, the correct Spring Place Road, is located? Right there. So the Confederates were not playing with a full deck. They were playing with a 4-road map north of town instead of a 5-road map like the Federal Army had. Why did the Federal Army have a better map? Because they had some great engineers, a guy named Ruger, a guy named Merrill, a guy named Dodge, a couple of others in the Army of the Cumberland, the forerunner of the modern United States Army, thanks to General Rosecrans and thanks to General Thomas, my favorite Yankee, other than my wife, of course, who's from Indiana. Shout out to Sherry in the Hoosier State. But George Henry Thomas from Virginia was in command of the Army of the Cumberland, and they had a really stout team of engineers. All right, one map begat another map. This is the second Confederate map, and notice that there is, I've circled a missing space. There's a missing connection. This map was based on the previous map, which did not connect the Spring Place Road to the road system leading into Cassville. And then it led to a third map. This was the map that General Joseph Wheeler made. So Wheeler was basing his cavalry screen on the 4 roads north of town. And he only covered 4, not 5. And you see the one that he missed. And there's the 4 that he covered. Back to that page 946. If you look to the left, he placed Iverson's Georgia Brigade here on the Adairsville Cassville Road. That's your Road 1. This Copper Mine Road, he called it. He placed Jabrell's Tennessee Brigade. He missed the connection of the Spring Place Road, so there's no cavalry force there. He placed some Alabamians under a fellow named Hannon, Hannon, here. And over here on another road, he placed Williams, or Grigsby, formerly Kentucky Brigade. But look where the Federals are going to come from. Historians for years have believed Johnston's version of the story and believed that this was the Spring Place Road, the old Spring Place Road that did like this. But this big basin here is Two Run Creek, and when white settlers came there after 1836, and in the 1840s and 50s, they moved the road to the east side of that basin where it didn't flood as bad. And there's the Ruger map. Notice how they have all 5. This is under the Army of the Cumberland. The Federals have Road 1, 2, 3, Spring Place Road, 4, and 5, Canton Road. So the Federals again have the map covered. So let's talk about who's been untruthful. How are we doing? Are y'all still with me on this? Okay, so you got the roads. If you know the back, if you look at the back of your hand, you can figure out the road system to Cassville. All right. Now, there was a young man named Thomas Bennett Mackall, Mackall, and it looks like Mackall. You want to pronounce it like Mackall, like macaroni, but it's Mackall. Thomas B. Mackall was a boy born in Baltimore. Now, Maryland sounds like a Union state, but actually the coast and Baltimore residents were more pro-Southern, the eastern part. The middle and western were more pro-North. Well, this Thomas B. Mackall, he had a cousin who was old enough to be his uncle. Thomas was like 19 when the war broke out. He was a student at the University of Virginia. He joined a regiment, but he washed out because he had a hernia. and was doing a desk job as a clerk. But his cousin, who was 55 years old enough to be his uncle, William Whan Makel, also of Baltimore, was General Joseph Johnston's chief of staff. So basically the second most important officer in the Army, because he's the mouthpiece. He's the one that writes all the orders that Johnston wants and is his closest advisor. So, you know, Eisenhower had his Bradley, right? Omar Bradley. And so imagine this type of relationship that William Makel was to Johnston. Well, William Makel brought his young cousin along with him for the ride during the Atlanta campaign. And now he's 22, 23 years old by this point of the war. And he kept a series of diaries. He kept a couple of notes or diaries, just little personal things as a boy, basically in the room where it happened. You know, anybody see the play Hamilton or the musical Hamilton? You know, the room where it happened. Well, he said he gets to be in the room where it happened. So imagine being a 20-year-old that can be in the room listening to Johnston and Makel and Hood and Polk and Hardee and Claiborne and all of these guys make plans for battles and talk about whatever they talk about. And that's what this guy is. Well, after the war, the United States government, the War Department, decided that they wanted to have an official record of what happened in the Civil War. And so they printed over a series of 20 years, 1881 to 1900, they printed these 128, 130 volumes of the official record of the war, of the rebellion of between the Union and Confederate armies. Okay, y'all seen those, right? Most of you, some of you have copies of them. All right. Well, if you go to that serial 74, which is, there are 5 volumes on the Atlanta campaign, by the way, serial 72 through 76. Go to serial 74, flip over to about page 978 to 986. There's about 12 pages there of something called Journal of the Army of Tennessee Confederate, kept by T.B. Makel, an aide de camp, an aide of the camp, whatever that means, and kept during the Atlanta campaign. And then underneath there's somebody seemed to understand, and it said furnished by J.E. Johnston. Well, that ought to be a red flag, right? So 20 years after the war, General Johnston furnished a typed up or a handwritten out manuscript version of this, whatever this so-called journal was, and submitted it to the War Department, and it was included as if it was an official record. Well, let me back up and explain. After the war was over, the federal government obviously had most of the northern reports. They won, right? They won the war. So most of the reports, after every campaign, every battle, they would ask the officer, the colonel or the captain or whoever was the highest ranking officer in command, would you please write a report about this unit or that unit? And so they would do that. And they compiled those into these official records. The problem is for the South, many of those were either lost or destroyed, or they were not. Obviously, the South kept the Southern officers maybe had their own personal copies of these. And there was a lot of distrust and disharmony. And so it took a real effort for the War Department, and they hired some Confederate, former Confederate soldiers like Marcellus Wright, Clement Evans, several others, to talk to their fellow brothers in the South and say, hey, it's okay, you can trust this project, it's going to be honest, would you please submit a copy of your report? In fact, some of the federal officers tried to do the same, say, hey, I've since learned more about what happened at this, I'd like to supplement my report. They said, no, we want the original. We don't want you to embellish 20 years later that, you know, it gets larger, Pinocchio's nose grows. But so what that means is in the official records, some of the Confederate records, number one, they're thinner. Okay, there are 5 volumes, but 80% of them are federal on the Atlanta campaign. Only about 20% are Confederate records. The second problem is many of them are supplied or contributed 20, 25 years after the war, which makes them suspect, obviously, because it gives them the opportunity to get the eraser out and maybe fix or change something. Well, that's what's critical about this document, this T.B. Makel journal, supposedly kept as an official report or journal supplied by Johnston. Well, historian and professor Richard McMurray in 1971 happened to be at the William and Mary Library, the SWIM library at William and Mary, researching the Joseph E. Johnston papers that are housed there. And what he discovered, of course, it was a Friday at 4 o'clock. He'd been researching all week at different libraries at the end of the week, into the trip. But he ran across these 2 diaries, and they were not named. There was no attribution for them. It just said 2 unknown diaries, but they were in the Johnston papers. It didn't make sense why. And so he began to thumb through them, and he realized that they had, one of them had abbreviations. It said like GEN period H says we must try this or go that way, or ART moved up, General P for Polk. And so Richard McMurray realized that whoever was writing this was somebody that was close to the action, close to the headquarters, in the room where it happened. Because he was writing about conversations between General J and General H and General P for Polk, and so H for Hood, or sometimes Hardee. And then there was the second diary that was more like, it read like A, the first one, but it had like more complete sentences. And so he labeled one A for control purposes and said that's the original because it's in abbreviated notes. And then the next one he labeled B as really a rewrite of A. And he then made arrangements, this is 1971, for a Xerox copy to be made and mailed to him, where he was a professor down at Valdosta State University on the Florida line in South Georgia, I-75 just before you hit Florida. And he made arrangements with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation handwriting experts. And he also contacted a fellow up at the National Archives to get the manuscript copy, this long blue paper, this legal size 8.5 by 14 size blue paper written out. That was the original manuscript that was supplied by Johnston that became what's in the Black Book, the official record. And he took those 3 samples and a 4th sample that he found out at the Huntington Library in San Diego, and a known writing sample of T.B. Makel, some letters that he had found. And he took them to the crime lab, and GBI, without knowing anything about the players or the history, he just said, tell me if these letters written by T.B. Makel is the same handwriting as that A diary, that B diary, and that blue sheet. That blue set of pages. And the results came back, yes, the A and the B are written by the same hand that wrote those letters. That's T.B. Makel, the boy. But whoever wrote the blue thing, the blue manuscript that became what's in the Black official records, was not written by the same handwriting. It's not T.B. Makel. And it is written by 2 other hands, 2 other writers. Who those are, we don't know even today. Is it Johnston and his wife? Is it Johnston and a other associate? We don't know. But it's not written by T.B. Makel. But here's the critical part. What's in the official record has been altered. And I don't mean just by a little bit. I mean by a lot. For example, in the original A sample, at 10:20 on the morning of May 19, when the attack was supposed to get started, in the A sample it says, heard skirmish fire on the Adairsville and Cassville Road, road number 1. That's true, that fits. You know why? Because John Fritz's ancestor in the 105th Illinois had Henry repeating rifles, and they were coming down the direct road from Adairsville. and they came into the zone about that time. And in 10 minutes, the A diary goes on, 10 minutes later, heard artillery on the Spring Place Road. That fits because that's road number 3, and that's where McCook and his cavalry and a guy named Lieutenant Ripito and the 18th Indiana Light Artillery, that's Eli Lilly's battery, by the way, and some of the 2nd Indiana Hoosier Cavalry and the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry, a large regiment, came galloping down, undetected, down that Spring Place Road. That's in the A diary. It's also in the B diary. But what's in the official record, on page 982 of the official record, 074, sir? All right, look there. What you're going to read is not going to read like that. It's going to say, report of skirmish fire at 10:20 on the Northwest Road, or the Adairsville Castle Road. Report of artillery fire 10 minutes later, east of town. The word Spring Place Road has been erased, and it's been replaced by the word east. So whoever made that alteration believed that it was, whatever that thing was that had artillery was east of town. But they've changed where the word Spring Place, in 2 other places in that false document, the blue document, 2 other places, Spring Place Road has been moved to the road number 2 location. Somebody has altered history, but we believed it because it was in the Bible, the official record, the official report. So we can learn today that history is not what we thought it was yesterday. Now that I've told you that, and I tell you that somebody has been misrepresenting to us, and I said, how many in the room think it was Johnston? Only one brave soul who may have already read the book raised his hand. Nobody else was willing to be so bold. But a number of you raised your hands because John Bell Hood has a damaged reputation. He has a bad reputation because of mistakes he made and poor decisions he made just a few months later, especially at Franklin and Nashville, right? Okay. So not all is as it seems. I'm going to get running out of time. I've got about 11 minutes according to the clock here. This is actually a sketch that Johnston drew, and it's in the book. And so if you like a good mystery, this book, The Cassville Affairs, it's a combination of a discussion of how do you fight if you're the smaller guy in a fight, the Confederates versus the Federals, number 1. Number 2, they're not quite as outnumbered as you like to think. We thought that they were really, really outnumbered. But by the time they get to Cassville, by the time I get to Cassville, is it Phoenix? I think it's Phoenix. All right. They're actually only outnumbered 90-something Federals, 1,000 to 70-something Confederate. You know what that looks like? It's like Lee at Gettysburg. Lee took 70,000 north to Gettysburg. Meade had about 90,000 to oppose. That's about roughly the numbers that Sherman and Johnston have. Not the first or second week of the campaign, but by the 3rd week of the campaign, by the time they get to Cassville, they're getting a lot closer. And while they're down at New Hope Line and those battles, what's called the Hellhole and Pickett's Mill and Dallas, and then on to Kennesaw, all during that time, the relative numbers of the Confederate and Federal forces are as close as they're going to get. All right. But this is a map that Johnston drew, and what's important about this map is that it shows how little he knew about the plan. The plan was actually John Bell Hood's plan, not Johnston's. Hood was the one who was constantly in Johnston's ear saying, we should attack, we need to attack, we can't wait, we don't have time. We only have a limited supply of men and manpower and munitions. This is the time we need to counterattack, like Lee was doing up in the wilderness and up in Virginia. That's what Hood was advocating. Johnston, to his credit, was allowing him to try it at times. May 12th at Crow Valley, north of Dalton. May 14, 15, Saturday, Sunday at Resaca, 2 attacks. And then this event, May 19 at Cassville, a Thursday. And then after Pickett's Mill, he also authorized Hood said, let me try to take the flank. And he never could find the flank. The Federals kept digging in and he couldn't quite get there. Finally, at Kolb's Farm, 22nd of June, just a week before, a few days before the battle at Kennesaw Mountain by Sherman. But all those were Hood's ideas, and Johnston letting it happen because Johnston was getting pressure. He was getting emails from Richmond saying, attack, face, fight, do not fall back. We can't afford to give up Rome or half of North Georgia or even Atlanta. We need you to be fighting Sherman up in the North Georgia mountains and wilderness, not giving up territory. All right, so that is the route of Hood's attack, or his plan. This gives you a good idea of just how little Johnston knew about this so-called battle. The map that he used in his narrative of military operations 10 years after the war was based on the faulty Confederate map that was only 10 miles either side of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. That's a draft of the map. Notice what's missing. This is where the Spring Place Road, where the Federals came from. So even in his own map, in his book, that's his apology of his efforts during the war, 10 years after the war, 1874 published, page 320. There's an insert map, and that's the map. Notice he's using a Confederate faulty partial map. All right, I pointed out that, and I bored y'all. I've driven this thing home about the Federal movement. But this is, again, the placement of the Confederate cavalry screen, and this is where McCook's people are going to come through. And it's going to be the best day of the Atlanta campaign for the Federal Army. And in particular, the 2nd Brigade, Stuart, 2nd Indiana, and 1st Wisconsin, and Ripeto's 18th Indiana Light Artillery that I've already told you about. Let's look at some of these players. Anybody know the famous McCooks? There's the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Dan. They're a famous fighting family. There were 17 of them from Ohio, fought throughout the war in various roles. This particular McCook is Edward McCook, who's in command of a division of Federal cavalry, about 2,500 troopers. And he's going to have about 1,000 troopers that are going to be with him making this attack that morning. And he's going to be bold enough to attack with 1,000 troopers attacking a column of Confederates marching across the field, infantry, 20,000 of them. Think that's pretty bold? I would say that's John Buford-like, Gettysburg-like. All right, in the middle is George Henry Thomas from Virginia, and then we have our protagonist or antagonist, depending upon your perspective, if you're a Georgia boy, General Sherman. By the way, when I was growing up, my family, my grandmother and ancestors would never use profanity, of course, with one exception, and was tied to Sherman, but we won't go any further than that right now. So, all right, so this is a depiction of the Federal cavalry charge at Cassville, and that is, imagine those, actually, we had an Iowa in the bunch. That's 8th Iowa depicted. It's an 8th Iowa sketch. Okay, this is an aerial photo of of Cassville. The actual town is right here. Cassville has an interesting history. This was the county seat of Cass County, but after the Battle of First Manassas, they changed the name of the county to Bartow County in honor of General Bartow, who was killed at the Confederate victorious Battle of Manassas, and the town changed her name to Manassas. In November 1864, first of all, after the Federals took over the town on the 19th and 20th of May and occupied it, for the next 6 months until November, it was a hospital town for the North. It had been a hospital town for the South, but after that, she was burned when Sherman got ready for his march to the sea when he moved to Atlanta. And some have said, well, it was because they were, it was a hotbed of Southern sympathizers and, Manassas and all that, and it was a rebellious town. But I think there was probably a more practical reason. Back in those days, when there was a hospital, a house or a building or a government building that had been used as a hospital, the thought was that there might be disease with it. They called it a pest house sometimes. And so many times houses or churches or buildings were burned, not because they were trying to punish necessarily. Maybe they were. So in some instances, certainly they were. Ask Decatur, Alabama, and we won't go there. But in this case, it may have been because of a lot of the buildings had been used as hospitals, and they were afraid of spread of disease. Anyway, that's an aerial photo. And back to our roads. There's our road number 1, road number 2, road number 3, 4, and 5. Oh, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. And I blew it up for you to see a little bit easier. We'll put some players on the map for you too. That was the plan. Johnston was going to, according to Johnston, he said he wanted Hood to come and strike against that road number 1, against Hooker's people. Some of your people, John, and my wife Sherry's ancestor from the 70th Indiana, Benjamin Harrison's brigade, president of the United States. Okay, so that's what Johnston said the plan was supposed to be. That's what we've all believed. And if you read any history book about Cassville, that's what they're going to tell you, and it's wrong, because we followed Johnston's version. The correct story was Hood was going after Schofield up there, but Hood got surprised by McCook over there. Okay? And if Johnston's story was true, all Hood had to do was just go up here and attack, not do all this other stuff to go attack some people on road number 2 instead of road number 1. Okay? So the correct version of what happened in history looks more like this. Hood was planning to make a strike on Schofield, who was supposed to be coming down that road, but he got surprised by McCook at 10:30, and they had 2 pieces of rifled artillery, 3-inch ordnance rifles. And the fun thing is, imagine going across that field, that large open field that Hood was going across. There was a Mississippi soldier that turned to a Colonel Taylor Beatty. I see I've only got about half a minute left. Colonel Taylor Beatty, and he told him, Colonel, sir, begging your pardon. Anybody seen the movie The Horse Soldiers, John Wayne? You know that actor that played, I think he played Parker, didn't he? Or I'm getting it. Festus, I'm sorry, played Festus in Gunsmoke. That actor, great talented fellow. Ken Curtis. Yeah, Ken Curtis. Colonel, sir, I'm begging your pardon, but there's Yankees forming off to our right. Colonel Beatty, Taylor Beatty from New Orleans, looks over to the east, and there's my warning, and he says, no, it can't be. It looks like a fence row. Well, that fence row was the first Wisconsin cavalry, about 800 or 900 of them, dismounting, and all the metal. When they came into a clearing at a place called Five Forks, where the Spring Place Road opens up and connects with that road number 4, 3 and 4 connect. When they got to that point, McCook ordered Lieutenant Ripito to deploy the 2 cannons to get ready, because look out there about 1.5 miles to our west is a Confederate column marching naked across that large open field. No, they were clothed, they weren't that kind of, but they didn't have any cavalry screening them. Very strange. That's what Buford says at Gettysburg. Remember that in the movie? Well, there was very strange. There's 20,000 Confederate infantry marching across that field, without any protection. Here comes Ripito with 1,000 troopers, 2 guns, and he drops 2 guns and gets them ready to fire. They have, these 3-inch ordnance rifles have about 1.25 miles accuracy. Okay, they're not the round balls like Wiley B. Coyote, they're the conical shape, the modern looking shell, right? Okay, that's an advancement in technology during the war. Well, they're getting ready to fire those. And Uncle Festus, our actor, imagine that person, that Mississippi soldier says, "Colonel, sir, begging your pardon, there's Yankees forming to our right." Well, McCook has ordered that 1st Wisconsin to dismount and provide a protection for the 2 guns. Meanwhile, the other 350 troopers in the 2nd Indiana Cavalry under James Stuart, not that Jimmy Stewart, James P. Stewart, has been ordered to go down to the other road. He connects on down to road number 5, the Canton Road, and they're basically galloping toward town looking for what's ahead. So what you have is a federal force that is deploying and striking Hood at the upper part of his column and also at the bottom of his column. He's about to get surprised in 2 places, at his front and his rear, his right flank and his rear. So Beatty rides up to Hood to say, "General, sir, we've been given a report that there may be federal troops off to the east." And Hood says, first, unconcerned, he says, "Well, it can't be. If it's anybody, it must be our cavalry. Wheeler hasn't told me about any threat to the east." So undeterred, Beatty goes back, Colonel Beatty, the New Orleans, goes back to his place in line. And a few moments later, that same Uncle Festus says, "Colonel, sorry, pardon me again, but you remember that fence row that you saw over there to the east? Well, it's a moving now, sir." And then, sure enough, that fence row is moving to this one. And so it wasn't a fence row, it was all the metal on all the sabers of that deploying Wisconsin unit. And so at that point, Beatty gallops back up to Hood, says, "General, there are Federals to the east." Hood says to Hindman, General Thomas C. Hindman from Arkansas, that's another story. Hindman send some people over there to develop the enemy. In other words, go find out who's over there. So Hindman turns to a guy named Jacob Sharp. Sharp's in command of a Mississippi brigade that had been commanded by General Tucker, who was wounded at just 5 days earlier up at Resaca. And so Jacob Sharp's now deployed the 9th Mississippi Battalion Sharpshooters and the 41st Mississippi Infantry, and they're moving to the east to figure out who it is. And McCook says, "Open fire." And Eli Lilly's descendant or successor, a fellow named Lieutenant Ripito, fires 6 rounds when the Confederates get a little closer within his range, and fires 6 of those really nice, beautiful conical shaped shells that explode about right over your head and can knock out anything within 30 yards. And he kills and wounds 5 Mississippians. 3 of them are buried at Cassville Cemetery. One of the wounded is, ironically, General Nathan Bedford Forrest's nephew. And as they start to get closer, on the back door, the 2nd Indiana Cavalry that keeps running down the 2nd road, they go galloping right up to the tail, and they run into the 63rd Virginia Confederate unit that's in the back of that marching column. And they fire, and they kill and wound. They kill 3 and wound 2, and turn and gallop just as fast as they came into town. They go out of town. One of the Virginians is able to get off a shot and wing one of the Hoosiers. They go galloping back up to meet McCook and his comrades. McCook sees them galloping toward him. He sees the Mississippians and some of the 20,000 marching to them, and he says, "Mount up." They get back up, they reattach the guns, and they bug out to about a mile north. That is the Cassville morning affair, and that is what blew the Confederate surprise, turned into a surprise on the Confederates, not on the Federals. A few minutes later, Makel, the older William Makel, has been ordered by Johnston to gallop up to Hood to tell him to hurry up with his attack. And he says, Johnston has ordered me to come to you to tell you to hurry up because over to the left, Hardee is getting pressure. The Federals are moving to Cassville faster than we thought from the west. Hurry up your attack. And Hood's response to Makel is, and they are on me too. And Makel says, where? Where? I don't see any Yankees. And Hood says, and didn't you see them? And Makel says, no, where? And Hood says, on both the Spring Place and the Canton roads. Direct quote from Hood's report written February 15, 1865, for Richmond, in the OR. Also in his Advance and Retreat, pages 99, 102, and 105 or 7. But if you go to those places, his story doesn't change. But Johnston's vacillates over his official record, over his narrative of military operations, and over a couple of other journals and articles that he writes later. Every time his story kind of changes a little bit. Hood's never changed. I'm out of time. Thank you all for having me tonight. And do you have time for any questions?
Time for 2 questions.
2. Okay.
Anybody?
Anybody have any questions? By the way, we have some books in the back. Thank you all for who's purchased some. I've still got about 10 or 12, and we would much rather sell them than have to fly back to Georgia with them. Yes, sir.
Dennis Weaver.
Dennis Weaver?
Yeah.
That's the actor.
That's,
Oh, Curtis was, the fellow over here got it right. I remember Ken Curtis was the actor's name. That was that John Wayne's, who's in a lot of John Wayne movies, the Ken Curtis stuff. But he had that real gravelly Southern accent that, but he had a beautiful voice too. He could sing. And anybody else with any questions?
All right. If not, thank you, Bob.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll see you next month. Actually, Ken Curtis was from Colorado.
Was he?
Schofield was just